Hello YouTube, Jonas Weefield here once again, and it's finally time for the Super Nintendo Sega Genesis video. Okay, here we go. Now I am ready to talk about all aspects of both systems. Both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis were 90s consoles. They were huge. And they mainly happened because of the NES. Both of them, actually. The Super Nintendo was obviously a sequel console to the NES, and the Genesis was meant to destroy the NES, which it did. So, they were both started by, well, the NES, basically. And, yeah, as I said, the Super Nintendo was a sequel console to the NES, and the Sega Genesis was a sequel console to the Sega Master System. Now, those are the history of both consoles. Now I'm about to talk about which system won the war. Neither of them did. Or both of them did, or you can, choose whichever one you want. But basically, the Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis in consoles, but Sega made more money because it had add-ons such as the 32X and the Sega CD. So ultimately, Sega made more money in the war, even though the Genesis was outsold. Now, what's better about these consoles? Well, let's talk about the games first. The most popular game on the Super Nintendo was Super Mario World. The most popular game on the Genesis was Sonic the Hedgehog. Mario was Nintendo's main character, and Sonic was Sega's main character. Which one of these two mascots was better? Well, Mario was well known throughout the days of the NES, and Sonic didn't come out until the end of the Sega Master System with the same game, Sonic the Hedgehog. Just a different 8-bit version of, the character and the game. Which character seemed cooler? To me, it was definitely Sonic. But Mario probably had more sales if you count that with the NES. Now today, both of them still exist, but I believe Sonic has been a bit stronger these past few years than Mario has, considering Nintendo is going down the hole. Yeah. Sonic has been a lot stronger because he's released games on all the major consoles. So, yeah. To me, Sonic is the better mascot. And not just because of what I just said, but because many kids back in the 90s wanted to be Sonic. So they finally got their chance when Sega came out. And it was just, a better approach. They'd rather be somebody who's acts cool and tough and all that. They'd rather be that than, a plumber. So, yeah. The first point goes to Sega. Let's talk about the music on the consoles. Sega had a better choice of music. Definitely. I mean, their music was more hardcore than Super Nintendo's, but the sound of the music was definitely better on the Super Nintendo. I mean, it was just hardcore. They went all out on the music. Sega, they didn't spend too much time on the music, and they did spend a lot of time on the game, which was good. So the music point would probably have to go to Nintendo. The Super Nintendo gets that point. The graphics. This is a hard one. many people believe that the Super Nintendo had better graphics than the Genesis, and even better than the 32X. The Genesis, I can understand it, how people would say that. But the 32X, that might be going overboard a bit. Just a bit. But, yeah. Hang on. I'm just saying that because the 32X was 32-bit. The Super Nintendo was only 16-bit. That's a fact. Many people say that the Nintendo was 32-bit, or the Super Nintendo, my bad. No, it was only 16-bit. It was 16-bit to match the Genesis. But we're not talking about the 32X here. Although I do thoroughly believe that the 32X had the better graphics. We're just talking about the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. There are some games on the Super Nintendo that have better graphics than the Genesis. But if you look up a comparison, like look up the Mortal Kombat comparison, and you can do it with or without blood, it doesn't matter. But if you look it up, you'll clearly see that the graphics are better than they are in the Super Nintendo. And that Mortal Kombat's not the only game. You can look up plenty of other games. The fact of the matter is that I do believe, for the most part, about 70% of the time, Genesis had the better graphics than the Nintendo did. So, yeah. Point. So it's 2-1 Genesis. 2 points Genesis, 1 point Super Nintendo. Let's see. I'm trying to think. The controllers. I'll do the controllers. Which system had the better controller? Well, there's no doubt in my mind that the Genesis had the cooler looking controller. But it's not all about how it looks. Genesis had a better handle on the controller, and as I just said, it looked a lot cooler than the Super Nintendo. Yeah. However, the Super Nintendo had more buttons on its controller, and I'm talking about the original controllers, not the reissues, and none of that. So the Super Nintendo had more buttons on its controller, and it was a lot easier to handle. Not literally handle with your hands, but to, do stuff in the game. So, yeah. Point number 2 for the Super Nintendo on the controllers, even though the Genesis controller is awesome. So, it's all tied up now, 2-2. Now, the design of the consoles. The three Genesis that came out, Genesis Mega Drives. Let's see. I'm trying to think. The first one was most obvious, had the 16-bit. Yeah. But the second one was meant to attach the 32X on the Sega CD, and I still believe that the third issue had CD built in and 32X built in. There were like 5 or 6 reissues of the Super Nintendo, all of which looked the same except for one, which looked like it had more colors than just gray and purple on it. But overall, the design would have to go to the Genesis because, wow, every Genesis looked awesome, and I especially like on the first issue of the Genesis how they put 16-bit, just clear as day 16-bit, to show that it was better than the Nintendo was. So 3-2 Genesis, yeah, it's that good. Now, let's see, what else do we have? We have the games. the games themselves. Okay, for the Super Nintendo, we had Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Super Mario Brothers. Let's see, we had Super Punch Out. Yeah, we had games like that. Now on the Genesis, we have games like Star, Sonic the Hedgehog. Um, yeah. Let's see, trying to think. Shinobi 3, that was another one. Yeah, those were all great games. Um, let's see. As stated before, I like Sonic better than Mario. That's pretty obvious. So that gives the games an advantage, for the Genesis at least. But I do like Mario a lot, and if I had to choose between Super Mario World and Shinobi 3, or Super Mario World and Rise Star, I'd choose Super Mario World, no doubt about it. However, Link to the Past and Shinobi 3, I'd choose Shinobi 3. Link to the Past and Rise Star, I would choose the Link to the Past. So, overall, it's really close, but the only reason I would choose the Genesis games is because of Sonic. I am a huge fan of Sonic. So 4-2, Genesis. Now, on the topic of games, there's one game on the Genesis that I like better than Sonic the Hedgehog, and one game on the Super Nintendo that I like more than Super Mario World. And that on the Super Nintendo would be Super Godzilla, and on the Genesis would be Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Now, first things first, what would I prefer? Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Godzilla? I would take Super Godzilla. And out of the characters Sonic the Hedgehog or Godzilla, if I had to go without one, I would choose to go without Sonic. Godzilla's just my main guy, you know. So, yeah, it's all about the gameplay now. Now, I've established that these are my two favorite games. Two of my favorite games of all time. But which one would I choose better? Choose better. Which one would I choose? Which one is better? Yeah. In the game Super Godzilla, you just go around blasting up enemies. In the game Sonic the Hedgehog, you just run and get rings. Basic. There is a boss fight at the end of each level of each of these games, but the Genesis had a lot more, you know, it utilized the colors more. And Super Nintendo had more color capacity, but Genesis utilized the color more. Okay, so, wow. This is really tough. Really, really tough. But I'd have to say, out of the two games, the one I like more just by a little bit is Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Genesis. Yeah, 5-2 Genesis. The reason I like it more is because you go more places. You go to, let's see, the Emerald Hill Zone, the chemical plant, you go all those places. And Super Godzilla, you're just in a city destroying stuff and you get to a boss fight. I would say it's repetitive, but it's not. It's really good. They change stuff up just a bit, and they have bagging in it. So, Super Godzilla, great game, awesome, amazingly made. Not too many people would agree with me, but I'd say I'd like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 just a tad bit more. So, yeah. The final score is 5-2 Genesis. It has beaten the Super Nintendo. Yeah. I like the Genesis more. I do. So, That's just my opinion on which of the two consoles is better. Now, I respect all the other people's opinions, including James Rolfe's. So, yeah, that is my final say on which of the two is better. So, be here next time when I start my game reviews, finally. In the meantime, goodbye, YouTube.